So just picking up where we just left off, I'm still working on my second layer, specifically on this side of my leaves. So I'm using my sort of limeier green that I had mixed, still being careful not to touch my table because I know that my table is wet still. The table that I painted, not the one that I'm leaning on. So painting around where that flower is going to go. So this is technically a second layer for the whole painting, but it's just the first layer on the leaves. So you do want to make sure that you remember that and pay attention to that, because it's going to be very tempting to get all of your leaf detail on there in one layer. But just like the rest of your painting, that's not going to be your best option. Your best option is going to be to continue to take your time, continue to build up those colors and values in layers. You might get some of the detail on there, like how I've got some of the darker areas and some of the lighter areas, but you're not going to get full detail in that first layer. Just going to mix some of the gray into the green, just because there is some grayish green up here towards the top. So again, it's very important to make sure that you have your reference image out, because if I didn't have my reference image out, I would not really know where all the different greens go and what they look like and what colors you use to make them. So you definitely want to make sure that you've got that reference image out so that you can be looking at it as you are working. So you'll notice that in some places, the leaves definitely cover up part of the background. That's totally fine. That's just because when we were working on the background nice and light, remember, we had to go over some of those pencil lines, which is totally fine. And it's actually better to do that because otherwise you're going to end up with pencil lines that you don't need, pencil lines in the wrong place, so on and so forth. The best thing to do is to just kind of ignore those pencil lines when you are starting out on the background and just paint right over them. Because like we were saying, you can still see the pencil lines. So like right now, I can still see where the leaves go, even though the background color is on top of some parts. So still just working on the leaves. It will take a while. Now I'm going to work on some of the leaves that are within my vase here. Remember, they look a little more just like green blobs because of the reflection and the refraction of that glass. And remember, on the glass, if I see white, it's going to be very important that I don't paint anything there right now. So you can see I'm kind of avoiding this part and I'm avoiding this because both of those areas are eventually going to be white highlights. And if I put green there right now, it's going to be nearly impossible to get it back to the color that I need, which is white. Just going to put a little more blue back into my green here, because there's definitely a darker section in here that has some blue in it. Still avoiding my highlights. And now it really does just look kind of like blobs in there. Maybe put a little bit of black in here because it's quite dark underneath here. You don't want to use much black at all, because remember, especially if you were doing an impressionist painting, they didn't really use black. They would use other darker colors to create the idea that black was there. So not much black at all. So as you can see, I am using some black in here, but it's black that is mixed with other colors. So it's not just a black. It's got some green in it, or it's got some blue in it, or so on and so forth. So that really it's just black being used to make a darker version of the color that I'm using. So now most of my leaves have been at least started on. So I'm going to scoot in here so that you can see a little bit better. So at this point, because of the way that the leaves are arranged, I could definitely go ahead and add a little bit more detail to some of those leaves before I start on the flowers. And so that is actually what I am going to do, just because that's my personal preference. I'm going to put a little bit of water down here with a little green in it. And then just sponge some of that up because it is lighter there than what I've got. There we go, that's getting closer. Now you'll notice that also because I'm putting the water only in certain areas to lift some of the color, what's happening is that it starts to look a little bit more three-dimensional already, just because that lighter area is very specifically placed now. So now I'm just going to add some of the shadow areas to some of these leaves. Remember, if I use black, I'm mixing it with other colors. I'm not just using it as black. Unless, like on the table, there was actually black. So then I'm going to turn my page so that I can work on the spot that comes kind of behind the flowers, because it's really dark right up next to the flower. But then it very quickly gets into that light sort of limey color. So what I'm going to do is sort of paint like that around where the flower is, and then down the edge because it's kind of dark here. But then what I'm going to do is dry my brush off and then sort of sponge it a little bit, sort of like we did on one of the other paintings where I was showing you how to do the sky on the San Giorgio. Because what that's going to do is give us a little bit of texture, but it's also going to help us get back to that lighter color pretty quickly. Using a little more water to help it spread. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and go back in with some yellowy green mixed with some gray because it's not like a super bright green. And then go back over this section a little bit. And there is an area right in here where it's quite light. So I'm just going to keep taking some of that color off with my brush. And then that might be the way that those leaves look from behind this flower. So now I'm just going to continue adding a little more detail to my leaves. Making them look a little bit more three-dimensional. Making them look a little more like what the actual painting does. Remember, I've got bigger brushes. I've got smaller brushes. Use the size brush that you feel is going to be most beneficial for the part of your painting that you are on. It's going to vary per person and per part of the painting. So it's okay if you don't use the same brush the whole time. So now I'm going to put a little more brown on this sort of stem that's under the flower, just because when I'm looking at the painting, I see more brown in there. And it goes in front of those leaves. And then that brown continues down into that part of the stem. But then you can see that the more I paint, the more that water that is on my brush sort of reactivates the green and makes it blend with the brown, which is exactly what I want to have happen, so that I get both colors sort of on that stem area. I'm going to turn my page again so that I can be using the tip of the brush along sort of the tip of the petals or the leaves here. There is sort of a brownish green petal coming up behind the whole flower there. So I'm going to go ahead and get that in there. Now remember, your paper is going to curl up a little bit, kind of like mine is. That's okay. It is a bit challenging and it can be a little frustrating, but the main thing is just to remember to go slow and hold your paper down whenever you need to. Some people do like to tape their paper to the page that they're working, or tape their paper to the table. You can definitely try that if you would like. I tend not to do that, mostly because, as you can tell, I turn the page a lot while I'm working. And if I have my paper taped down, I can't do that. So for me, I just tend to hold the page and press it down in when I need to, so that I can still be turning it whenever I want. So now I'm going to go back into some of these leaves a little bit more. Mostly just putting some of those shadow areas where they need to be. Now the leaves that are within my vase, I'm mostly just going to leave pretty simple because they're not very detailed since they are actually within that vase. Now I'm going to put a little bit of brown here. Mostly because that part of the leaf almost blends in with the background. So I do want to make sure it has enough brown so that it has that sort of blending effect with the brown that is around it. And there's a couple of areas where you kind of just have like sort of streaks that look like leaves coming off of that area. So I'm just going to add some of those in while I'm over here. Once again, just kind of working on making sure my colors are good and accurate, making sure they have the details, highlights, shadows, so on and so forth. Notice that all of this time I am still only working on the leaves. I have not even started looking at the flowers yet. And I know that the flowers are going to have their own process very similar to the leaves once I do get there. But I want to get my leaves a little further along before I do the flowers, since the flowers are in front of those leaves. So I know it doesn't look like I'm doing very much. And a lot of that is just because your layers build up incrementally. They don't build up just all at once. It's not like you have no detail and then all of a sudden you have a ton of detail. Each layer, you may not necessarily see everything that gets done, but it does all add up to create a final piece. So that might be sort of how I would consider the leaves pretty well finished. Not necessarily 100% finished, but close.